Slavery ended with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 at the end of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln set all the slaves free, right? And we lived happily ever after. After that, everybody was free and everybody was equal, right? How many of you learned that in school, middle school, high school? How many of you learned, I know I did, that the Emancipation Proclamation made all the slaves free and equal? Maybe not equal. I think, did we learn about Jim Crow? I don't know about that. But anyway, the answer to that is no. Absolutely not. Wrong. Not even close to what really happened. I'm Carolyn. Welcome back to another episode of As I See It, and happy Juneteenth. So in case you don't know, Juneteenth is short for June 19th, and it's basically an African American celebration of the day that the troops went in and freed the last of the slaves in Texas 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. And I thought it would be a good idea to kind of do a little history today. I dove in, did a little bit of research. Seems like every time I research these issues, I learn new things or I'm reminded of new pieces of history. And this started because of a comment or a tweet I saw on Twitter this morning about how someone else just was like mind blown. How did we end up with Trump after Obama? And I had a brand new thought about that I'm going to share with you at the end. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the history of slavery, the 13th Amendment, the Emancipation Proclamation, and Juneteenth, and how they all worked together to get us where we are today. There's some facts that are going to shock you. There are some facts that shocked me. And I'm pretty up on history. At least I'd like to think I am, but I'm still learning every day. There's a lot to learn. I'm still learning every day. And that's why I think it's really important that we teach accurate, factual history. Because if we don't know our history, we don't understand people's experiences. We don't understand socioeconomic, sociological impacts on parts of our society, our fellow Americans. It's going to be really hard to understand their experience if we don't understand the past. The next time you have a family reunion or you're a member of a family who says that that's ancient history, it happened a long time ago, it's no excuse for the way black people are today, it's no excuse for poverty because they don't believe in systemic racism, things like that. Ask your family member this. How much of who you are today do you think was influenced by your parents? How much of who they are do you think was influenced by their parents and their parents and on down the line? How much of who you are today do you think was influenced by your ancestors? Property, where you live, property that your family owns, inheritances that might have been left or not. But even me, who's, not, it's not like I've had inheritances. It's not like I've come from wealth. But even I can recognize that who I am today is a result of who my mother was, who her mother was, and her father. So if someone can accept that, if somebody can admit that they are a product of their ancestry, why wouldn't that apply to people of color, to black people in our society, Asian people in our society, Hispanic people? Why would they not be products of their ancestry just the way you are? Certain privileges, certain blocks to success and things like that. So that's one thought. Lincoln ended the Civil War, and it's so funny in history. They made him out to be a hero who cared about slaves. He didn't. It was a total economic thing. We all know that. In reading up on it again today, he really wanted to free the slaves in the southern states, and I think it was very much an economic thing. I think we all know that. It was that he wanted to ruin the southern states economically, I think is really what it was about, because they wanted to win the war. They wanted the northern states, who, by the way, also owned slaves. They wanted the northern states to prosper and to be, I guess, on top in this new united America. But unfortunately, even with the proclamation, the Emancipation Proclamation, that news didn't reach slaves in many southern states. Texas being a great example. Slaves weren't allowed to read. I mean, they got punished, but they were not allowed to read. And through lies and misinformation and an inability to be able to read and have access to information, a lot of slaves in the South didn't know that they were supposed to be free. And so that's why on June 19th, 1865, Union troops had to go down and literally free the remaining slaves in Texas. But we all know that that was just the beginning. That was just the beginning of fighting for equality and freedom for many former slaves. So interestingly enough, all slavery was not illegal. This was about emancipating Southern slaves. Again, it was an economic thing. It was an economic decision in order to have Northern supremacy. Now, I think that's really all it was. They wanted to ruin the Southern states by taking away their free labor. I don't think it was even as much about freeing slaves as we still tend to think it is. And in fact, the proclamation exempted border states. Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, Kentucky were exempt from this proclamation. So these states didn't have to free their slaves. So it wasn't about freeing slaves, it was about economics. It was about winning the Civil War. So when the troops went down and freed the slaves in Texas 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, there was a big, huge celebration. Women, children, men were free, finally, for the first time in some of their lives, probably ever. And there was a big celebration that came to be known as Juneteenth in the African American community, and for generations remained a day of remembrance and joy and celebration of freedom, kind of like an Independence Day in many ways for former slaves and ancestors of former slaves. But the thing is, the Emancipation Proclamation freed some slaves, not all slaves. It did not make slavery illegal. And in fact, slavery did not become illegal in the entire U.S. until the ratification of the 13th Amendment, a few months after Juneteenth in December of 1865. So still 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, it was still legal to own slaves in the United States. However, the language of the 13th Amendment, which still, if you read the 13th Amendment today, the language says slavery is illegal except as punishment for crime. And this is a whole other issue. I'm just basically covering the basics of Juneteenth and emancipation and the end of slavery today. We all know about the industrial prison state, and after the end of slavery, the official end of slavery, and after the Emancipation Proclamation and after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, there was this exception that you could basically have a slave, or you could be enslaved as punishment for a crime. And this started all kinds of horrendous things during Jim Crow. Black men getting arrested for loitering, black men getting arrested for bogus crimes, and then being put back into slavery because it was allowed as long as the slavery was punishment for a crime. It was allowed. So they started really rounding up black men on the streets and putting them in prison for hardly any offense whatsoever, so that they could keep enslaving them, so that they could keep getting this free labor. And this is very much what we are seeing the results. We're seeing the results of those laws today. Our prisons are predominantly filled with black men. And it's not because black men commit more crimes. We know that. Whole other video. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but study after study after study have shown that black men get more prison time for the same crimes. Black men, we know, get shot more than white men, and the list goes on. So we very much have a police system, a police state that wants to continue to imprison black men. And in fact, even though the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, there were a lot of states who refused to ratify it. They just flat out said, no, we're not going to. Kentucky, Delaware, They resisted ratifying it for decades, and Mississippi, the last state to ratify the 13th Amendment, refused to pass it until 1995 and didn't formally file the passage until 2013. So the 13th Amendment, which outlawed enslaving other people unless they're convicted of a crime, then you can enslave them. 2013, Mississippi was the last one to fully ratify that. So when people want to say that racism is not a thing, that black people are pulling the race card, and that they're the one who keep bringing up race, 2013, we're talking 10 years ago, Mississippi refused to even tell its citizens, yeah, you have a right to be free. Right? And you want to say all people are equal and they should just get over it? How can the black citizens of this country, the black citizens especially of Mississippi, feel equal when their state refused to acknowledge that they have a right to be free by ratifying the 13th Amendment? So that's the history of the 13th Amendment. That's the history of Juneteenth. That's the history of the Emancipation Proclamation. We all know that there were loopholes. Rich people, the people in power, the white plantation owners, all the rich, powerful men in Washington, they all find every loophole there is to continue to perform in their best economic interest, even if that meant enslaving other people. So we know that loophole after loophole, that the struggle for true freedom for African Americans is still going on today. Again, look at the prisons. So just wanted to share a little bit of the history because we're all celebrating Juneteenth today. And I think just like we all thought the Emancipation Proclamation freed everybody, we might be under the impression that Juneteenth also freed everyone. It didn't. And in fact, the 13th Amendment didn't even really free everyone. We still have very much systemic systems in place, which still very much say that it's okay to enslave certain people under certain conditions. And that brings me to this thought that I had, a brand new thought about how we ended up with the orange mango Mussolini after the Obama, very successful 8-year Obama presidency. And this was kind of a new thought for me. I know everybody here is woke and we're proud to be woke. What's the opposite of woke? Being asleep. I don't want to be asleep. What does it mean to be asleep? It means to just let the world pass you by, let whatever happened to you, not be awake, not be aware, not fight back. I mean, it's so loaded, and it's amazing that they think that it's an insult to be awake. But most of us here are very aware of the fact that there is still very much systemic racism in this country, and that there are still many forces that want to hold many of us down. People of color, indigenous people, women, LGBTQ, trans people. I mean, this war that has been created by half the country against others. And my thought on this, and we still wonder sometimes, how the heck did we get here? How did this country get to this point? And a lot of us have said, how did we go from 8 years of Obama? No president is perfect, and I'm not going to put him on a pedestal and say he was perfect. He's not a god, because we're not a cult. We don't worship him like a god. But he did a lot of great things. He was an amazing negotiator, intensely brilliant, and just I look back on the Obama days at like the generation before me looked back at the JFK days, I think, right? It was like just a really great time. Our first black president. We're really making progress. And then we ended up with somebody like Trump. And here is what I think. Racism is still very much alive in this country. Systemic racism is still very active in this country. We know that. A lot of people who are not woke will deny that they are racist. They will deny that they think less of Black people, women, gay people, they have every excuse in the book. They want to use the Bible as an excuse. They want to deny that some people in our society might have less privilege than they do. I don't have any privilege. I had to work for everything I had. A lot of people just choose to be willfully ignorant about certain things in our society. So then we get a president like Obama. And I'm going to use terms that I'm going to use terms that I think they might use. And we've had this conversation on this channel before about a well-spoken black man and things like that. But I'm going to use terms that we used, all of us used, maybe without thinking about the whole picture of that. But I'm going to talk about Obama in terms of a collective consciousness, okay? Even though you know how I feel about these things. But he was classy. Him and Michelle, the epitome of class. Like JFK, like the Kennedys. I don't think that's a bad thing to say. I don't think he's classy for a black man. He's classy, period. Classy, intelligent, in love. I mean, there's so many things about them. Again, I think of them like the Kennedys. But I think for a large part of our society who looked at this black man who has class, has intelligence, extremely well spoken, extremely smart, extremely well respected in this country. And for the race deniers, for the racism deniers, who deep down in their hearts are racist, they saw this black man succeed to the highest office, to the highest rank in the world, the most powerful man in the world. And I'm wondering if the people who didn't vote for him, the people who voted for Trump, somewhere deep down inside know the challenges black people in this society face. I wonder, they must know on some level because they are part of perpetuating it. They are perpetuating the microaggressions, you can't blame it on the color of your skin, and many of the microaggressions. They are the ones who are putting that out there. And so here's this black man who has succeeded against all odds. And they've got to know this on some level. They've got to know this because we see mostly white men in power. We see mostly white men at heads of companies. We see mostly white men in any visible power position in our country, in government, in business, in science, in medicine. It's all mostly white men. So there's got to be, even if it's unconscious, there's got to be an unconscious realization that it is hard for black people, for women of color, or at least harder for many of us to achieve those powers of those positions of power. I think on some level they knew that. They couldn't admit it in a million years. They probably weren't even conscious of it. I guarantee they weren't conscious of it. But somewhere deep inside, they knew all the hurdles he must have overcome to rise above, to become the most powerful man in the world. And it made them feel like shit about themselves. They had privilege that he never had. And I'm not talking about money or power or influence or intellect. I'm just talking about the fact that their skin was not a roadblock. They could have had the world. I'm talking about the people who support Trump. The average white guy who supports Trump and wants to blame everybody else for their failures. I think on some level they knew everything Obama had to overcome to get where he was, and it made them feel worse about themselves. If he can do it, I couldn't. What's wrong with me? How come I couldn't do it? I mean, I've done everything in my power to not let this happen. I've been a bigot. I've been a racist, or at the very giving them the benefit of the doubt, they've denied the very existence of racism, and yet he was able to become president, and I can't even get a raise. I don't even have a job. I can't even have my kids. I can't even see my kids. I can't talk to my kids. My wife took a restraining order out on me. I mean, all of these things. that plague the loser white guy who supports Trump. I think that I'm getting deep into psychology here, and I'm not a psychologist, but I think on some level they knew. I think on some level they knew all the burdens, all the hurdles Obama had to overcome, and it made them feel weak because they couldn't overcome hurdles to have success, whatever that looks like in their own lives. Getting the things they want, getting the better house, the better car, the better job. It forced them to look at themselves and say, why can't I? I mean, look at everything he had to deal with, and he was able to do it. How come I can't do it? Along comes Trump. They're wallowing in that self-doubt, which is very uncomfortable for many of them. The last thing they want to do is look at themselves. The last thing they want to do is turn inward and say, what can I do to improve my situation? What have I done to cause this? It's a very painful, I know, been there. It's a very painful, difficult place to be. They don't want to be there. And so along comes Trump and says, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And that's why they elected him. Because Trump came along and said, it's not your fault. It's the liberals' fault. It's women's fault. It's trans people's fault. It's gay people's fault. It's black people's fault with all this. It's all the affirmative action. It's all women who all of a sudden want to be in the workplace and they're stealing your jobs, and all the gay people and all the immigrants. Trump came along and told all these people who for a minute started feeling like they had failed because they couldn't achieve what a black man had achieved despite all the boots on his head. They didn't like that feeling. They didn't like having to turn inward. And so Trump came along and said, you don't have to. It's not your fault. It's everybody else's fault. And I'm going to save you because I am going to crush the liberals. I'm going to put women back in the kitchen. We're going to put black people back, with fewer rights. So they'll never be president again. They won't be CEOs. We're going to put all the people who caused you to be a failure down. That's what Trump promised them. That is what Trump promised them. And that's why he elected them. The unfortunate thing is they are ignorant of history. They are ignorant that this is what fascist dictators do. They fill weak-minded people's heads with otherisms and promises that only he can save them. They don't understand because they don't know, because they haven't studied, that they're going to go too. In the end, they're just collateral damage. Their rights are next. So just a little food for thought today as we celebrate Juneteenth and one of the steps toward the emancipation and equality of all people in our society. But I think we all know the fight's not over for any of us, for women, for people of color, for indigenous, for LGBTQ. We are still fighting the fight in 2023. All right, leave your comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you all so much for listening and for being here, and I'll see you soon.